Hi everyone, welcome back to Lee's Play. Today we are going to be continuing with our Tomb Engine and Tomb Editor Complete Beginners tutorial, and today is lesson 2 where we're going to be making claustrophobic caves and tunnels. If you haven't watched lesson 1, which was building our very first room in the editor, do go back and check it out as we build an underground waterfall cave, and it's very cool, and we're going to be continuing off of that. So everything that I teach you in that first video, I'm going to assume you already know for this one. So let's jump in and load into our project level, and let's open our level to bring up the tomb editor. So if you're following this at the same pace that I'm teaching it, this is what you should see. You should see our basic geometry, and you should see our textures if you go to phase edit mode of the underground waterfall cave that we made in the very first lesson. And today we're going to build more rooms and tunnels for Lara to travel through before she makes her way outside into the Lost Valley, where we all know the infamous dinosaurs and T-Rexes are. In the side panel, you might notice that under room options, it says 0, room 0. That's because this is the very first room we ever built, and in technical computer terms, the first room is typically referred to as 0 because in computer and tech and programming and coding, number 1 is actually like 0. It's like 0 to 9 is 1 to 10, because of like integers and mathematics. So for all intents and purposes, this is the very first room, but it's actually referred to as room 0. But what we're actually going to do is go ahead and press the pencil button here, which allows you to change the name. And we're going to change it to Waterfall Cave. And press OK. This is a really great habit to get into now while we're in the very beginning of the tutorial, because as the map gets bigger and bigger and we start going outside and building lots and lots of rooms, having labels is a great way to keep track of where your rooms are, and just in case you want to change them, you want to change some textures, you want to add some gameplays, some lighting, which we'll do in a later video. It's great to have your rooms labeled and not just generic. If we press the plus button here, it will give us the option to add a new room. So let's go ahead and press that. Now you should see that a new room has popped up on your map. And as you can see, the old one has gone away. So we got a brand new blank looking room with no textures on it. Let's go back to geometry mode by pressing the 3D button. If we use the drop-down menu here in room options, we can also go back to our original room, the waterfall cave, which we just labeled. Now, if you remember in the first lesson, we discussed how where this waterfall here is what I'm considering north, because it's pointing north up here on this 2D map. And we kind of also know that here where we have this little inlet where we want these tunnels and caves to be, that's obviously south, because it's south here on this little 2D mini map. That kind of tells us what we need to be building towards in terms of continuing Lara's path. So let's go back to room 1, which we had just created. And so we know that since the room has that inlet south, that we're kind of building north and working our way from there. We know it's going to be kind of coming from the north direction. A big question you may have is, how does Lara make her way from the waterfall cave into this new room? Tomb Raider levels are a series of rooms connected by doors or portals, and essentially it's kind of like building a house in The Sims and putting a door from a kitchen into a sitting room, into a bedroom, or into a bathroom of your own house. We need to add a door or a portal that will take us from Waterfall Cave into room 1. How do we do that? Today we're going to be actually looking at a new view of Tomb Editor, which is the 2D view, by pressing 2D map. This brings up a much more technical blueprint. It's almost like an architecture blueprint of a house, just say you're building, and it gives us a look at all the rooms on the map. So the room that's being highlighted in red is that waterfall cave, and you can see that because it's smaller than room 1, which if I press is much bigger, and that's why it's bigger on the 2D map view. The only basics you need to know for now is that we should keep everything inside of this grid. It looks like grid paper that architects would draw on. We want to keep the rooms within this for technical reasons, which will be explained in a much more advanced lesson. This measurement on the right hand side, you might see that goes from y equals 1k to y equals minus 1k, tells us more about the position of the room vertically in terms of height. If you remember the classic Tomb Raider level St. Francis of Folly, where Lara can travel all the way from the top to the bottom of that level, there was a lot of climbing in that level. That was a level that had a lot of vertical geometry and a lot of rooms that were connected by doors vertically. And we use height for that instance, but we're not going to be exploring that today. We're going to be doing as like an introduction to the 2D map. So what I want you to do is actually go back to Waterfall Cave, which you can now see is highlighted in red. And with a simple left click, let's move it on this grid paper. Now I want you to click on room 1 and drag it underneath. Why are we dragging it underneath? Well, if I click on Waterfall Cave and I go back to 3D geometry view, as we discussed before, this where the waterfall is was our north, and where we built the little inlet for Lara to travel through the caves and tunnels, that's facing south. So, on a 2D map, that will basically lead us into room 1. And you can see I put them right up against each other like that. So we're going to be making our very first door together, and it's quite simple. There's actually many ways to do it. For now, all I want you to do is let's find that inlet where we said Lara would eventually explore tunnels and caves. We're going to highlight it together, which is 3 tiles wide. And we're going to press this black door here in sector options called Add Portal. Some people call it portal, some people call it doors. It might be easier for you to remember it as a door, but going forward, we will call it a portal. However, there is an icon of a door, so you shouldn't get too confused. And we're going to press Add Portal. As you can see on our 2D map, there is black on the grey area, and that basically tells us it's now connected to something, and we know that it's now connected to room 1. So if we go to the 2D map and now click on room 1, you can also see there's a matching black square up here because the two are connected to each other. You can also see in the mini map that there's like these thin dotted lines. That typically tells us that the rooms are connected. The portal system is actually quite intuitive and will prevent you from making many user errors. For example, if you decide to drag this room 1 anywhere around the graph paper, it will actually bring the waterfall cave with us because they're connected, so they have to stay together at all times. When we go back to the waterfall cave in 3D view, you might notice that there's like a ceiling here in yellow. The yellow is just basically indicating to you that there's a portal or a door underneath this that brings you into another room. The reason why we have this is, if you remember in the last video, we actually raised the ceiling of this room to be taller. So the ceiling in this room is taller in Waterfall Cave than it is in room 1. While we're going to be working on these rooms individually, you can actually preview what the rooms all look like together by pressing this I button here called Draw Portals. Once you press it, you can see the original waterfall cave we worked on in the last video with our new room right here. And you can even use the camera view to move the map around so you can get a better look of what you're working on. As you can see, the ceiling in this room is shorter than the ceiling in this room. We're going to turn portals off for the moment so we can concentrate on this room today. As I mentioned, today we're going to be creating dark tunnels and caves for Lara to travel around before she makes her way outside into the Lost Valley. So what we're going to do is make a narrow corridor for Lara to travel down. To do that, we're going to select tiles that we want. I think this is going to be a nice, tight, claustrophobic corridor. So this is how big I want this new room to be. And again, we're going to crop it with the crop room button, which I showed you in the last video tutorial. We're going to press OK. And that will say with a warning, if you crop this room, all portals and triggers outside the new area will be deleted. Do you want to continue? That means if we had placed anything here outside of these red squares, like a texture or a doorway, that will be deleted once we crop the room. However, as you can see on our 2D mini map, we're cropping the room to squares where the door already is, so that will stay there. Don't forget you can save your level by going to File and Save. In the last tutorial video, I explained the basics of building geometry in Tomb Editor, so you should be very familiar with all this. But what we're going to do now is basically build out our cavern for Lara to travel through. So let's keep, as we did before, molding shapes in the room. So I'm going to put this up like that to kind of make it seem claustrophobic and tight. What we never did before in the last video was actually adjust geometry on the ceiling. However, we're going to do that today to make the room look even smaller so that when Lara climbs into it, it seems really small and claustrophobic. We're going to do that by pulling squares down from the ceiling. And I'm going to use the arrows to draw the rooms down in a shape of a cavern. In fact, while in the last video we raised the ceiling, let's lower the ceiling for this room to make it look really small and tight to give the player a feeling that they're going to be caught in a tight space Feel free to experiment with this to make the shape of cave that you want. I'm going to just make it really random, just so that it looks very, very interesting. I'm going to put some ledges on the ground that Lara can climb onto. Later on, you may decide you can put some pickups on this, like a weapon or a medipack. As you can see, we're making a really organic shape. It's looking kind of like a cavern. I'm really happy with how this is turning out. I'm happy with the shape of this room for the moment, so we're going to move on and texture it. I explained basic texturing to you in the last video, so you should be quite familiar with going into face edit mode and using the brush to pick a texture from the texture sidebar and to apply it on all the tiles in this room. However, today I'm going to be teaching you a bit more about texturing on how to make your textures look even better when you place them. Do you notice how on the floor and on the ceiling there are perfect squares, meaning that the horizontal line and the vertical line are exact same, therefore the shape of a square? But if we look at these walls, they're not square shaped. It's more of a rectangle, a long rectangle. Well, when you look at our textures and when we click on them, you may notice that they're highlighted in the shape of a perfect square. That means that while we apply it to a floor, it may come out looking flawless. For example, if we take a look at this face texture, as you can see, it's perfectly square, so it looks accurate. If we place it on this wall here, the face is stretched in on the hieroglyph because it's a rectangle and not a perfect square, like the way the square is selected in this texture window. This then gives an effect that we call stretched textures. Level builders who make Tomb Raider custom levels often try to avoid this because the textures look very low in quality and make the level look quite ugly. So how do we avoid having stretched textures? Well, it involves us modifying these walls so that we can get them into the shape of squares without actually changing the height of the ceiling or the floor. What we essentially want to do is kind of like grid paper, which I showed you in this 2D map, the way this looks a bit like grid paper that an architect draws on. What we want to do is actually apply the same logic to these walls. So what I'm going to do is highlight all the walls that I can see on this side, and then left clicking from the bottom, I'm going to hold down the left click button and drag up, and you will see this new line being drawn on the wall. It's 4 clicks in height, so as you can see, that is a perfect square. And I'm going to do the same from the ceiling by clicking towards the edge of the ceiling and dragging down. The only issue I see now, however, is that while we have a perfect square there and we have a perfect square there, we now have another rectangle in the middle that's very, very small. So we know that when we apply this texture, it's actually not going to look so good. What we're aiming for is to get these squares as even as possible. So as you can see now, they kind of look even. They're still rectangular, but they do look better. What I'm going to do instead though is drag the ceiling one back out. So now we only have one line from the bottom, and I'm going to bring this up 4 times. And now what I'm going to do is bring that one from the ceiling back, but I'm just going to leave it like that. So now we got 2 perfect squares, and we have a really rectangular shape for the very top towards the ceiling. That is because the exposed area of the wall that we can currently see is 9 clicks high. Let's go ahead and do the same to the other walls. Remember, you can pull these lines down from the ceiling and from the floor. Highlight all the exposed wall you can see. Left click and drag from the ground to bring that up. And I'm going to drag down from the ceiling to expose this. And now, as you can see, our walls are now showing squares the same way the floors are. And that means when we apply textures from the texture panel onto all of these squares, the presentation should look a lot better. Let's go back to face edit mode. And as you can see, that square tile I placed with the texture of the Incan hieroglyph earlier looks as good now on the wall as it does on the floor because it's perfectly square, and that's a square texture. If I press draw portals, it will remind us of what our textures looked like outside. And as you can see outside, we used a lot of rocky textures of stone, cement, and other kind of cave natural materials. So why don't we continue doing that on the inside? We used a lot of this white stone, so why don't we use some white stone here as well? On our texture panel, let's find the white stone. In the last video, I would have used the same texture and applied it like this. Why don't we do something that looks a bit better? On the texture panel, as you can see, there are actually 4 stone textures. 1, 2, 3, and if we move this to the right, 4. And as you can see, we have a 3 tile width gap that we need to cover with textures. I've already placed this texture here. Why don't we grab this texture and place it there, and grab this third texture and place it there. They all have now unique textures, so unlike this room outside where we use the same texture on all the caves, which looks quite repetitive and like wallpaper, here it looks a lot more natural and a lot more organic. We can do the same by applying this texture on this wall, this texture on that wall, and this texture on this wall. As you can see, because these are not perfectly square shaped, the textures are looking quite distorted and it doesn't look as perfect as this ink and hieroglyph does on this wall, which is perfectly square. I will explain to you later on in the video on how to make these perfectly square as well, so you can get better textures. Let's find the cement texture and paint the ground with it again. Why don't we paint this set of blocks here with this texture of some stone? And as you can see, we have a lot of transition textures, which I explained to you in the last video, and we can use them to blend it better with the cement on the ground. As you can see, this looks a bit better because it looks like the cement is blending with the stone rock textures. And maybe I'll even put that one on the ground just to give it an illusion of what we're looking at. What you see here is what's called a seam. As you can see, the end of this texture does not match up with the beginning of this texture. That's why when it's optimal, you want to find something called a seamless texture, which basically means that when you place them beside each other, it doesn't have a wallpaper effect and that they look like they belong next to each other. Sometimes though, when you don't have a seamless texture, one technique you can do is to mirror this texture to that texture, meaning that this kind of pattern here will match up on this side. To do that, you don't have to make any new textures. All you have to do is make sure you have the same texture selected and hold Control down on your keyboard and press. Well, that still doesn't look perfect. It does look a lot better as the cement transition here kind of lines up with each other. Since I have these lined up in a perfect square, why don't we apply some of these ground textures, one after another. And let's follow it along to this wall too. So as you can see, while the texturing doesn't look absolutely perfect, it is much stronger than what we did in the last lesson where I basically introduced you to the basics of texturing. You should see that the texturing is slowly starting to improve and look better and then more what you're used to. But what are we going to do about these rectangles up here? We're going to need to find a rectangle shaped texture that we can apply to the area. Well, here's a fun trick. Did you know that you can manipulate texture in the texture panel by being able to move these corners? So what we can actually do is match our textures to fit the shape that we have for any given scenario. So since this is a really wide rectangle, let's make our texture into the shape of a wide rectangle. And when we apply it, it's no longer stretched the same way this texture is there or this texture is here in that gap. When we place it, as you can see, it actually fills in perfectly. Doesn't that look much better? And it's the same concept. You just adjust the selection of texture to the shape you want to fill and apply it. As you can see, this can get quite time consuming. Something you can do to speed up the process is to use a selection of texture you've already placed on a wall somewhere else. To do that, what you want to do is hold down the Alt key and left click on a texture, and it will automatically select that texture on the texturing panel and the selection you made on that specific tile. And we can use that then to grab textures from other walls and apply to this one to speed up the process, rather than having to do it every single time. I'm going to rotate with the Shift key. This potentially could make for a really good texture for our ceiling. Why don't we apply it to our ceiling? And as you can see, our room is now completely textured, and the texturing does look better in this room than the texturing does in this room. So we are going to progress together. Since we made this portal or door that connects the underground waterfall cave to our new room, As you can see in this room, this area of the map is no longer textured, so we have to go back into this room and texture that. To do so, go to the drop down menu and go back to Waterfall Cave. Now obviously we wanted new textures to match up what we already did in the last lesson, so again, holding down the Alt key, let's select that texture. Let's get it perfectly square and let's apply it. If you remember, we put some stone here on the inside of our new room, so let's match that up. Doesn't that look good? Now that we've built our new room in no time at all, why don't we go ahead and test it? As you can see, Lara is still there, which means that we can actually make the level. So let's go and save it, and let's go and build the level. Once we load in, we can see the exact same underground waterfall cave that we built in the last lesson, but if we turn Lara around, we can see our new room that we just built there together. And as you can see, it looks like Lara is going from the underground waterfall cave into this dark, claustrophobic tunnel and cavern. Already you can see that the texturing does look quite better. It's not perfect just yet, but it is a remarkable improvement over the texturing in this room, which where all the textures are the same and everything looks really repetitive. So immediately you should already see how your technique is improving and how your building skills are going to get better and better. When you're finished exploring, press P again to exit to the main menu and then to go back to our tomb editor. Why don't you go ahead and rename this room to Claustrophobic Tunnel like I've done here by changing the label and the room name. Once you've done that, let's go ahead and make yet another room. This has been the Claustrophobic Tunnel. Let's make the next room where Lara's going to begin climbing some rocks and stones to make our way outside into the Lost Valley. So we press the plus button, which brings up room 2, which is basically our third room, because again, we start counting from 0 and not 1. And if we go to our 2D map here, you can see it's now at the bottom left corner, and we want to bring it along to our other 2 rooms, which are already connected together. So we're going to bring them together until they're touching and making sure all rooms remain within the grid paper of this 2D map view. And again, what we want to do is basically go back into our claustrophobic tunnel. I previously showed you how to make a door by selecting where you want the door to go and press portal. But another way you can do it is by using this 2D mini map here, and that's the way most level builders will use it, because when you're making swimming pools and you're building doorways, for up here in the ceiling or down here on the ground for a swimming pool, it's much easier to do that in a 2D map view than it is in a 3D view. So to get used to it, why don't we select these 3 tiles here in the 2D mini map and press add portal. Now, as you can see, the third room is now connected to our other 2, and you can really start to see now how a level is going to be built and how your level is going to work. A Tomb Raider level really is just a collection of rooms connected by a doorway or a portal. If you want to delete a portal, you can highlight it by right-clicking on anywhere on the black square on the 2D minimap, and it'll be outlined in a green color. And then simply press the delete key on your keyboard and you'll have an option to delete the portal in room 2 to the claustrophobic tunnel that we previously built. And if you press yes, that will delete the portal. I actually deleted the portal because I don't want every tile to be connected to a doorway. This was a claustrophobic tunnel. So rather than connecting these 3 tiles, why don't we just connect the middle one together like this? So click just one tile on the mini map. You can either pick this one, or this one, whatever you prefer, and press add portal. Now you can see only one tile is going to open out here, making it much tighter, much smaller, and more like a cave and an underground tomb and temple. When you make a portal like this, something you may notice is that there's not really any thickness or any width between this wall here and this wall here. That's referred to something in Tomb Raider as a paper thin wall. And an easy way to not have a paper thin wall, like in this situation, is to select a tile where the paper thin wall you want to be brought out. And actually, beside the portal icon, there is an icon to set a wall. So let's press that. And as you can see, a wall has been built on this specific tile. So now it's no longer paper thin between this room and that room. So why don't we go ahead and do the same on this side so that there's a thick wall to give the illusion that it's not like a paper thin wall, because that looks quite bad in the game. In this room, because we want Lara Croft scaling up mountains and rocks, we're going to kind of make it tall. This room was quite claustrophobic, but again, remember, we want Lara to start, climbing and using her platforming skills. So what we're going to do is start building some rocks around here for Lara to climb so she can make her way outside into the Lost Valley eventually. A quick refresher if you don't remember, Lara herself is about 3 clicks tall and the highest she can grab is 7 clicks tall. That means Lara will be able to run up and jump and grab onto this. Maybe let's make this one 4 clicks tall. As you can see, she's really going to have to do a lot of climbing in this room. And actually we're about to run out of room, so why don't we go ahead and raise the ceiling? I showed you in the last tutorial how to do that, so I'm going to do this quite quickly, but it involves you selecting every tile on this mini map and then dragging up to raise the ceiling. Actually, let's make this 7 clicks tall. We'll make this maybe like 5. Why don't we raise the ceiling one more time and make it 20 tiles tall, quite like our original underground waterfall cave over here, which was also 20 tiles tall. Yeah, that looks like a big challenge for Lara to start climbing. While the room is certainly going to be taller because again we need Lara to climb all this, I actually don't want the room to be too big. Why don't we crop it about this much by pressing the crop button? Gonna look like a cave, but Lara has some climbing to do in this level. I don't actually want pillars in this room, so why don't we add walls here as well? Why don't we pull the ceiling down here? Again, if you need to get a better view, hold shift and move the mouse around. If the other rooms are distracting you, remember you can turn the view off by pressing draw portals up here, so you can focus on one room at a time. You know what, I've changed my mind. I want to make the room even smaller, so what I'm going to do is crop it even further to this amount. In fact, I don't really even have any interest for this section here, so why don't I crop it even further to the amount I really only want to have. Maybe I'll put some walls here. You know, I might put something else there, maybe another room with a puzzle. And just like in our previous rooms, what I'm going to do now is just do some sculpting around the environment just to make it look like rocks. We might even do something more advanced with the ceiling and have it sloping upwards because, you know, the ceiling will have to be raised as Lara starts climbing up, but we don't want the room to look too big either because we want it still to feel claustrophobic. So we can kind of do something like that. Kind of a slope going this direction, because again Lara's not going to be hanging out of the ceiling anyway, so even though she's making her way up, it's still going to feel like she's bouldering and rock climbing. I might even put a wall there. This should really help give the illusion that Lara's in a very tight environment. So as you can see, in its own way, the shape of the rooms are getting more complex as we move on. What started out as an original square with just some molding and sculpting we've done to the floor, it's now progressed into, sculpting everywhere, and now we've got a really unique shape in this room. Before we start texturing, why don't we go ahead and draw those lines on the walls so that we have perfect squares to put our textures onto. Remember, you can drag it down from the ceiling and from the floor. Sometimes with these unique shapes, when you have slopes, they won't draw down at the same way that the regular walls will. And that's really just going to be a matter of trial and error. When something like this happens, as you can see, the slope has been brought down, but it isn't straight. You can do that by finding the arrow pointing in the direction you want and then lifting like that. And then pressing escape to get out of that. You might be wondering, is there a way to make a perfect square on something that isn't a wall? For example, this platform here Lara wants to climb. If you want to texture it properly, is there any way that we can divide it into smaller squares? Well, yes, you can. Simply select on the tile you want and then press the E button on your keyboard and a new line will be raised. If you want to lower it, press D. Now that the walls have been divided into kind of more of a square shape than crazy rectangles that are either too wide or too long, let's go ahead and start texturing. Again, making sure it matches up with the way we textured our previous rooms so that our level has a consistent art style. Let's go to face edit mode. And like always, let's start texturing. Remember, you can adjust the selection of the texture to match the shape of the tile you wish to texture. more texturing you do, the more you'll start thinking about your technique and what textures you wish to place on which tile and how you kind of wish to rotate them and manipulate them to make the environment look the best it can be. As you can see, even this room has a substantial improvement over this room, which in itself was a big improvement over this room. We have just finished texturing this room, and as you can see, even without looking at the other rooms, it's looking a lot more sophisticated. The texturing is a lot more interesting. It's going to look a lot more like a Tomb Raider level. Our geometry has gotten more advanced with a sloped ceiling and for some platforming for Lara to climb up of before she makes her way outside into the Lost Valley. And yeah, when we draw portals and you can see all the other rooms it's connected to, you can really start to see our level come to shape. Why don't we go ahead and save the level and test it again. Now when we're playing, you can see that all 3 rooms are connected. And this is our brand new room where our texturing probably looks the best. As you can see, it's a remarkable improvement over the waterfall cave we did in the last lesson. And again, the more texturing and building you do, the better you're going to be at texturing and building environments. That was a 7-click tall gap, so Lara was just about to be able to jump up and reach it. And as you can see, there's a lot of platforming going on here. We can even play it from where we'd imagine Lara would begin in the level, as she works her way down the underground waterfall cave in through these dark tunnels and caverns. As always, when you're finished testing, do be sure to press the P button to exit to title and to return to the tomb editor. Now that we're happy with how this room looks, why don't we give it a name? And let's make another new room where Lara's going to have to climb down before she makes her way outside into the Lost Valley. Let's go to the 2D map and bring it over here. Let's go back to 3D view of our rock climbing cave, which we had just completed. And let's go ahead and draw a door over where we want Lara to climb down to by pressing the portal button. Oh, look at that, an error. There's no possible room candidates for a portal. Why are you encountering this? Well, it's actually simple when you think about it. You remember how we made this ceiling really tall? And remember how the room started out much shorter? Well, if you go back to this room here, as you can see, it's still short as ever. A better way to even visualize that is to press this button here called Draw All Rooms. That will draw all rooms you have created, even if they're not connected to each other by a door. So as you can see, these are not connected yet. As you can see, there's no doorway on this 2D map, but you can start to see why we cannot make a doorway, because the gap up here where we want the door to be is just far above the ceiling of this room. So what we need to do is to get them to match up with each other. So what we're going to do, as always, again, is use our 2D mini map to drag all of the available room. And let's raise that ceiling up until we can kind of get them to match each other. If you remember the measurements of the last room, the ceiling went as high as 20 tiles, y equal to 20. So let's set to that. Let's go back to our rock climbing cave. And let's now try drawing a portal. As you can see, now that the ceiling was able to match up, we are now able to draw a portal in there, and now we're able to connect this room to all the other rooms. You can easily jump between 2 rooms by not using the drop-down menu, but by simply double-clicking on the room where you want to be. So what we're trying to create in this room, Lara made her way, she did some rock climbing to climb up this wall, and she found a gap that takes her outside into the Lost Valley with the dinosaurs and the T-Rexes. So we kind of have to do something almost similar to this room, but in reverse, so Lara can climb her way down onto the ground again. Why don't we raise this up? And again, this should be basically almost second nature to you now, but we're kind of making environments that allow Lara to make her way down safely. As I think about what I want the shape of this room to be, I'm actually going to crop it, because again, I still want this to be kind of claustrophobic and tight. So we've just cropped it like that. And as always, let's go ahead and start shaping our cave. set walls allows you to make really custom shapes for a room that aren't just squares or long rectangles or wide rectangles. They allow you to make really interestingly shaped rooms. You know, I've actually made a decision. I don't need the room to be any bigger than that. So something I can do is to crop it even further because these walls really mean nothing to me, so I don't mind losing them. And like I've shown you today, I'm going to start drawing walls so we can divide these walls into square shapes just to make the texturing look better. Let's press the Draw Portals button so we can see how well it matches up to the previous room. That looks quite good. And then let's go to Face Edit mode so we can see what the textures look like on this side, just to make sure it somewhat matches up on the other side. Remember, we can divide these into squares as well. However, since we've already dragged them themselves, we have to use the E key on the keyboard to draw additional lines like this. Now, as I mentioned before, what we eventually want to do is bring Lara Croft outside into the infamous Lost Valley. So what we should probably actually start doing now is looking for a new set of textures to tell the player that they're going into a new area. In this situation, I'm actually looking for grass because we're going outside. That looks like a really great grass texture with no imperfections on it, so let's start applying this. Let's start looking for a good transition texture. So I'm starting to transition towards more grassy textures because we know in the next video when we go outside, it's going to be a lot of grass and nature textures outside. Okay, that looks great. Since we know that's going to be an outside area, you have several options. You really don't have to texture it, although when you go in and test the level, it's going to draw a black void. So maybe for the moment, just so we have something there to allude to what we want it to be, we can find some sort of texture to tell us that eventually that's going to be an outside. So that can be something really simple. I mean, we can also just pick something like grass because we know in the future we're going outside. So we can do something like that. It really doesn't matter for the tutorial because eventually we will be making another room to connect to that room. So now if we move the camera out, you can see all the rooms we have created so far. And it's really impressive that even in one tutorial, if you followed along with me, we created 3 rooms together in one tutorial. And the texturing in them is much better than in our last lesson because again, as you do more and more building and you get to grips more and more with, the building blocks and textures and the concepts of what good texturing is, you're going to improve on your own. Why don't we test it one more time by saving and building the level? Now that we've loaded into the level, all 4 rooms should be connected to each other and we should be easily able to traverse it. And this is our 4th new room here. And then eventually in the next video, we are going to be building the outside of the cave. Basically, we're going into the Lost Valley where all the dinosaurs and the puzzles and the T-Rex is. And that's going to be really exciting. But as you can see, we have a really great foundation here. We did a really great job building some underground caves in this lesson and in the last lesson. And you should now be really, really familiar with geometry and to some degree even texturing. Texturing can get even more advanced than this, but by now you should have a really good grasp of some texturing concepts and what makes textures look good in a Tomb Raider level. When you're finished exploring, do go back and exit out into the Tomb Editor once more. One of the last things we need to do is actually give this room a name, so let's call it Entry to Jungle. And that means when we browse the rooms in our room options, we know exactly what each room is as this list starts to populate. Before I end the video, I'm actually going to propose a challenge to you, or some homework if you will. Yes, even a Tomb Raider level editing tutorial in Tomb Engine and Tomb Editor is going to have some homework. Now, I have gotten much better at texturing. We're not quite advanced just yet, but you can definitely see there has been an improvement between the texturing in this room and the texturing in this room. Vast improvement over what the texturing looked like out here. Why don't you go ahead and go to textures, clear all textures in room, and with everything you learned today about how to subdivide these walls into squares and good texturing techniques, why don't you go ahead and retexture this room from lesson 1 using everything you learned today to see if you can make a better looking level. In fact, I'm going to even play along and retexture this room myself with all the techniques I've showed you in today's video so that this room can look even better than what we done in the last lesson. So I'm going to leave the video off here. I hope you enjoyed it. Do subscribe to stay tuned for the next tutorial. There should be a playlist on my channel so you can catch up with the previous installments. Hope you guys enjoyed watching. Hopefully this will help you build your Tomb Raider levels in Tomb Engine and Tomb Editor. Of course, don't forget to subscribe and give the video a thumbs up, and I will see you all in the next video. And I hope you enjoy this time lapse of me retexturing this room with the new techniques I showed you today. Goodbye. So I've finished retexturing the Lost Valley waterfall cave area as the homework. I'm still going to use the ceiling, just a plain texture for now, because as I said in a later lesson, we will be building up here to make the cave even taller and to add the swan dive section. So this is what the homework looks like done, and as you can see with the new texturing techniques, it now looks visually better and it's more in line with everything else I've shown you today. Let's go ahead and build a level to see what this original room from lesson 1 looks like with the updated texturing techniques. So using our new texturing techniques, as you can see, the room from lesson 1, the underground waterfall cave, does look much better now that I've shown you those new techniques. It still doesn't look amazing, but you can see a substantial improvement over how it looked at the beginning of this video and from the last lesson. But this is kind of the standard. Nothing too stretched, nothing too crazy. It doesn't look like wallpaper. It doesn't look too repetitive. And you got good variety, and we're using really great transition textures that blend one type of texture to another, so that the ground here blends better to this white stone wall. If you decided to watch the homework, I hope you enjoyed watching that. That's exactly what you should be going for when you try retexturing the room on your own, or you go for even better than that. But then this is actually the final part of the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'm going to say goodbye one more time. Thank you.